It all started with something so small, so unassuming, that nobody in their right mind would have guessed it would spark the greatest suburban rebellion since someone on Christmas lights one day too long. An almond. Yes, you heard me right. A single, unsalted, organically grown almond. The kind of almond that costs more per ounce than gas during a holiday weekend. And yet, to Leo, the guy at the center of this story, it wasn't just a snack. No, this almond was a holy relic, the cornerstone of a daily ritual that made his mornings feel like something out of a Zen monastery, except with more caffeine and way more fur. Every morning, Leo would stroll onto his back porch with a steaming mug of coffee in one hand and that all-powerful almond in the other. His backyard wasn't big, about a 10 by 12 foot stretch of pressure-treated wood, just enough space to sit down, breathe in the suburban air, and pretend the HOA didn't exist. But for him, that porch wasn't just lumber. It was a temple, a sanctuary, a neutral zone between his carefully climate-controlled life as a work-from-home graphic designer and the aggressively uniform wilderness of his neighborhood, Maple Creek Estates. Now, most people in Maple Creek Estates were perfectly content with their HOA-approved existence. Lawns so green they looked fake, beige houses lined up like Monopoly pieces, and driveways so clean you could eat off them. Though, let's be honest, if you dropped a French fry out there, Carol, the HOA president, would fine you for unauthorized grease stains. But Leo wasn't most people. He had a blue bird feeder that wasn't regulation beige, grass that was maybe half an inch too long, and most offensively, he had a squirrel buddy. That squirrel wasn't just any squirrel. His name was General Eisenhower, or Ike for short. Don't ask why he was named after a five-star general. Some things just make sense when you meet the squirrel. Ike had presence, gravitas, a tail so fluffy it practically waved like a battle flag. When Ike perched on the porch railing, he didn't just look like a squirrel begging for food. He looked like a furry statesman waiting to negotiate peace terms. And negotiate he did. Each morning, Leo held up his almond like a priest offering communion. Ike stared with his tiny black eyes, whiskers twitching like an old war veteran calculating troop movements. A silent telepathic conversation happened right there on the porch. This almond for your loyalty, this nut for your continued friendship, this tribute for your honorable service to the yard. Ike would accept the offering with regal dignity and then scamper off to stash it like he was protecting the crown jewels. For Leo, this wasn't just feeding wildlife. This was community building. It was a friendship forged in nuts, caffeine, and quiet rebellion. It was the most important meeting on his calendar, a boardroom summit between man and squirrel, where the stakes were high and the snacks were premium. But here's the thing about rituals. They're fragile. They depend on peace, consistency, the universe aligning just right so the coffee is hot, the almond is crunchy, and the squirrel shows up on schedule. And if you've ever lived in a neighborhood with an HOA, you already know, peace doesn't last forever. Somewhere, somehow, someone always ruins it. And in this case, that someone had a name, Carol, or as the neighborhood would come to know her, the clipboard tyrant. But we're not there yet. For now, it was just Leo, Ike, and that sacred almond. You can almost picture it. Steam rising off the coffee, sunlight glinting off Ike's whiskers, the almond passing from one world to another like a peace treaty sealed nut form. It was balance. It was harmony. It was a man and a squirrel against the world. And that, my friends, is where our story truly begins. A single almond, a furry general, and a quiet morning ritual that would soon ignite an HOA war so over the top, it makes Game of Thrones look like a polite book club spat. But if Carol thought a pink slip could end this sacred nut diplomacy, she was about to find out. Some wars aren't fought with swords. They're fought with almonds, sarcasm, and the kind of pettiness only a suburban HOA can inspire.
Every villain has an entrance. Some descend from helicopters in action movies, others step out of black limos in mob films. But in the HOA cinematic universe, They arrive on your lawn at 8 a.m. sharp, armed with nothing but passive aggression and a clipboard that gleams in the sun like the sword of a very petty angel. Carol didn't walk across Leo's lawn that morning. She marched, knees up, arms swinging with purpose, face locked in the expression of someone who considers jaywalking a capital crime. She wasn't just a neighbor. She wasn't even just an HOA president. She was a full-on suburban dictator, the Ayatollah of acceptable hues, the Führer of flower beds, the general of beige uniformity. To give you some context, Maple Creek Estates had always been the kind of neighborhood where conformity wasn't just encouraged, it was demanded. Every mailbox the same, every driveway spotless, every lawn a chemically engineered shade of green that looked less like grass than the color setting on a big box store paint swatch called corporate envy. People didn't rebel here. They barely breathed without HOA approval. But Carol made sure of it. You see, Carol hadn't always been in charge. The old HOA president, Bill, was a kindly retiree whose biggest concern was whether the annual petunia contest got enough entries. Bill kept things light. Bill kept the peace. But Bill moved to Florida, where HOA rules go to retire and play shuffleboard, and into the vacuum stepped Carol. She didn't just win the HOA presidency, she campaigned like she was running for Suburban Dictator of the Year. Rumor has it she went door to door with a measuring tape, checking the length of people's grass before they even had the chance to say hello. And the second she got power, boom. Clipboards, patrols, pink slips raining down like confetti at a dictatorship parade. So picture this scene. Leo is sitting on his porch, coffee steaming, Ike the squirrel perched nobly on the railing, almond diplomacy in full swing. Suddenly, the sunlight dims. Not because of clouds, but because Carol is striding across his lawn, her visor cutting through the air like a battle axe. Ike freezes. Animals, as we all know, can sense danger, and this wasn't just danger. This was HOA danger, far scarier than foxes or hawks. "Excuse me," Carol said, her voice carrying that nasal sharpness that exists solely to ruin other people's mornings. "Are you the resident here?" Leo, in classic smart aleck fashion, sipped his coffee slowly before replying. "Unless I'm in the middle of a very boring home invasion, yes." She didn't laugh. Carol didn't do laughter. In fact, most people in the neighborhood weren't entirely sure she had tear ducts, a soul, or even the basic capacity to enjoy nachos. Instead, she introduced herself with all the warmth of a tax audit. "I'm Carol, your new Homeowners Association president." Translation? Bow before me, peasant. But Carol's gaze wasn't really on Leo. It was on Ike. Ike, who had the audacity, the unmitigated gall to exist on Leo's porch railing, paws twitching, fur shining in the morning sun. Carol's lip curled in disgust. And that's when she dropped the bomb. Section 14, Subarticle C, Paragraph 2, expressly forbids the attraction and harboring of nuisance wildlife. She paused dramatically before spitting the word rodents. The way she said it, you'd think Ike had just run off with her inheritance, keyed her Lexus, and insulted her casserole all in one day. Ike stared back, as still as a statue. If squirrels could roll their eyes, he would have. Leo tried to defend his friend. With all due respect, that's General Eisenhower. He survived more winters than most of us, and technically squirrels are Sciuridae, not Muridae. It's a common misconception. But Carol wasn't impressed with zoology lessons. She was already scribbling furiously on her clipboard, which I'm convinced was powered not by ink, but the sheer fury of suburban pettiness. A few furious strokes later, she handed Leo a piece of paper. A notice, printed on Pepto-Bismol pink paper. His crime? Feeding squirrels. His punishment? A $50 fine. And the kicker? It was written in Comic Sans. If there's ever been a greater crime against humanity, I haven't seen it. Carol stood tall, visor glinting, clipboard snapping shut like the end of a court case. She declared, 48 hours. Cease all squirrel feeding activities or face further consequences. Leo looked at the slip, then at Ike, who tilted his head as if to say, "So, are we still good for that walnut?" And in that moment, Leo knew. this wasn't just about an almond anymore. This was about freedom, about rebellion, about one man's right to share snacks with a squirrel without being micromanaged by someone whose hair helmet could probably deflect bullets. The first shots of war had been fired, and Carol had no idea just how creative Leo's counterattack was about to get. Because here's the thing about HOA battles. When you tell someone they can't feed a squirrel, sometimes they don't just buy a bigger feeder, they build an empire.
If you've ever been fined by an HOA for something ridiculous, like leaving your trash can out 5 minutes too long or daring to own a wind chime that's too melodic, then you already know. Compliance is boring, but pettiness is an art form. And Leo? He wasn't just about to pay a $50 fine and walk away. Oh no, he was about to fight back in the most gloriously over-the-top way imaginable. You see, Carol thought she could scare him with one bright pink slip. She thought she could weaponize Comic Sans into submission. What she didn't realize was that Leo wasn't built to surrender. He was built to escalate. And escalate he did by building what can only be described as the suburban Versailles of squirrel dining. Leo's counterattack began in the most dangerous of places, the high-end garden supply store. You know the type, the kind where the staff wear khaki aprons and the cheapest flower pot costs more than your monthly Wi-Fi bill. Instead of sensible HOA-approved bird feeders, Leo bypassed the budget aisle like a man on a mission. His eyes locked on the one. And what a sight it was. A 3-foot-tall, copper-roofed gazebo-style bird feeder with no fewer than 8 feeding perches and delicate filigreed archways. It didn't look like a bird feeder at all. It looked like a tiny, nut-based Taj Mahal. It looked like the kind of feeder squirrels write love poems about. Honestly, it belonged in the Louvre, not a backyard. Leo bought it on the spot. And let me tell you, he didn't just fill it with any old birdseed. No, sir. He went gourmet. We're talking black oil sunflower seeds, peanuts, cracked corn, and a medley of tree nuts that probably had its own Yelp reviews. He wasn't feeding squirrels. He was hosting a Michelin-starred squirrel banquet. But Leo didn't stop there. Oh no, because true pettiness requires detail. So he marched to a trophy shop, got a custom brass plaque engraved, and mounted it on the base of his feeder. It read, "For avian use only. Squirrels strictly prohibited. Violators will be gently nudged." That, ladies and gentlemen, is malicious compliance at its finest. On paper, it was for birds. In practice, within 10 minutes, it was a squirrel rave. Ike was there, of course, leading the charge like a furry Napoleon. Squirrels lounged on the copper roof like sunbathers at a luxury resort. Others played chase through the archways, stuffing their faces with the nut medley as if it was the last buffet on earth. It wasn't a feeder. It was a festival. It was a bacchanal of bushy-tailed bliss. And Leo? He sat back in his wicker chair, sipping his coffee like a smug Bond villain watching his evil plan unfold. And you better believe Carol saw it. She didn't need to march over this time. Her kitchen window gave her a front row seat to the Nut Gala of 2023. And while Leo couldn't see her face, he swore he could feel her rage radiating across the property line, hotter than a microwave burrito. The next morning, the inevitable happened. Another pink slip. But this one was different. Oh, it wasn't just a notice. It was a dossier. Carol had taken surveillance photos. That's right, she whipped out a zoom lens and snapped incriminating shots of Ike mid-bite, his tiny face a picture of pure, unrepentant joy. She circled the fine amount in red marker 3 times, added 3 aggressive exclamation points, and scrawled the words, "Further action will be taken." Imagine that, a grown woman so enraged by squirrels eating peanuts that she turned into a one-woman CIA. If she could have waterboarded Ike for intel, she probably would have. But to Leo, the second pink slip wasn't a defeat. It was proof. Proof that he'd hit a nerve. Proof that his counterattack was working. Because the first rule of HOA warfare is this: if they're fuming, you're winning. And trust me, Leo wasn't done.
If Carol thought a feeder was bad, she had no idea the storm of architectural insanity about to descend on Maple Creek Estates. Because why stop at a Taj Mahal feeder when you can build an entire squirrel city? If Carol wanted war, Leo was about to go full urban planner.
Here's the thing about pettiness. It's like potato chips. You can't just stop at one. Once you've tasted the sweet, salty crunch of revenge, you're already reaching back into the bag for another. And Leo? He had just built the Squirrel Taj Mahal, and already he was hungry for more. The second pink slip sat on his coffee table like a neon pink scarlet letter. Carol had escalated, circling fines in red ink like some deranged suburban general issuing a battle order. But instead of feeling defeated, Leo poured himself a bourbon. Not a beer, not a soda, a bourbon. That's how you know a plan is about to get either genius-level brilliant or absolutely insane. In Leo's case, it was both. At first, his mind wandered to something small, something simple. A little wooden box for Ike to hide from the rain. Maybe a cozy nook with a slanted roof. Harmless, practical. But the thing about bourbon is, it doesn't fuel practicality, it fuels ambition. And as the warm burn spread through his veins, the box became a cottage. The cottage sprouted a porch. A rocking chair appeared. Then a neighbor house. Then another. Then a whole town square. Suddenly, Leo wasn't sketching a squirrel shack, he was designing a full-blown squirrel metropolis. And here's the kicker, he wasn't joking, he wasn't doodling for fun, he was dead serious. Because nothing says take that to an HOA dictator like building a rodent utopia so detailed it makes their beige little world implode under the weight of creativity. He spread blueprint paper across his drafting table, the same table he usually used to design logos for gluten-free dog biscuits or artisanal pickle jars. But not this night. This night, the pencil practically had a mind of its own. Stroke after stroke, he carved out the plans for Nuttingham. Yes, you heard right, Nuttingham, a squirrel city so elaborate it needed its own tourism board. There would be streets, parks, commercial districts, a town hall with a miniature clock tower, a nut bank called Stash & Co., a tavern named the Nutty Acorn, complete with a beer garden serving nut-infused water. There'd be a library, a wellness spa offering pine cone massages, even a tiny theater where, presumably, squirrels could put on their own off-Broadway productions of Hamilton, with Ike starring as Hamilton, obviously. The more he sketched, the more manic his creativity became. He wasn't out to annoy Carol anymore, he was out to create art. This wasn't just revenge, it was legacy. It was Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel, except instead of God and Adam, it was a squirrel on a rocking chair. And when the blueprint was finished, Leo sat back and stared. He had gone from homeowner to visionary, from HOA victim to urban planner of rodents. This wasn't just a city, this was defiance incarnate. A sprawling, architecturally sound, aesthetically flawless squirrel utopia. Nuttingham wasn't going to be a collection of birdhouses slapped together with glue. No. It was going to be a master-planned community with infrastructure, landscaping, and the kind of curb appeal Zillow would kill to list. Leo raised his bourbon glass, whispered, "To Nuttingham," and clinked it against the empty air. Of course, there was one tiny problem. Leo couldn't actually build it. His DIY skills peaked at assembling IKEA shelves, and even then, he usually ended up with extra screws and existential dread. He could design the Eiffel Tower of squirrel habitat, sure, but actually hammering it together? Yeah, that was going to take more than bourbon courage. But in that moment, staring at the sprawling blueprint, he didn't care. Nuttingham was born. It was absurd. It was impractical. It was magnificent. And most importantly, it was going to make Carol's visors spin in rage like a helicopter rotor.
Every great rebellion needs allies. Frodo had Sam. Batman had Alfred. The Avengers had, well, basically everyone. And Leo? He had a half-finished bottle of bourbon, an insane blueprint for a squirrel metropolis, and absolutely zero construction skills. Which meant one thing. He needed backup. Not just any backup, specialists, experts, people who could look at his blueprints and say, yeah, I can build that. Tiny spa, nut bank, squirrel tavern, and all. So, like any modern revolutionary, Leo did what any of us would do when facing HOA tyranny. He hit Google. His search history that night read like the fever dream of a very confused architect. Custom miniature builder, high-end dollhouse construction, tiny architect for rodents, and my personal favorite, Squirrel City contractors. Shockingly, the first few results weren't helpful. Too much pink plastic, too many prefab dollhouses that looked like Barbie's nightmare. But buried deep on page 3, there it was, Tiny Tim's Timber Works. Slogan? We build small dreams big. Now, if that's not destiny, I don't know what is. Leo dialed the number. On the second ring, a gravelly voice answered, Frank. Frank didn't do pleasantries. Frank didn't do small talk. Frank sounded like a man who'd chopped more wood than Paul Bunyan and probably wrestled the grizzly bear at least once. Leo nervously explained his idea. So, I want to build a city for squirrels. There was silence, long enough for Leo to think he'd just been hung up on. But then a sound emerged. A chuckle, a deep rumbling laugh that could only come from a man who had inhaled more sawdust than oxygen. A city, huh? Tell me more. Single-family dwellings, mixed-use zoning, traffic flow. Squirrels are notorious jaywalkers. And just like that, Leo had found his guy. An hour later, Frank was standing in Leo's living room, and let me tell you, this man looked like a lumberjack Santa Claus, a mountain of a man with a wild gray beard that looked like it contained sawdust, secrets, and possibly a family of nesting wrens. Overalls, flannel shirt, smelled faintly of cedar and destiny. He picked up Leo's blueprints, squinted at them with the focus of a surgeon, and muttered, Georgian Town Hall. Ambitious. I like it. And this tavern needs walnut for the bar top. Gotta give it atmosphere. Frank was in, but he wasn't coming alone. Because Frank had a secret weapon, his niece, Chloe. She was a landscape architecture student specializing in small-scale ecosystems, and according to Frank, a genius with moss. Within 20 minutes, Chloe arrived. Now, Chloe was everything Frank wasn't. Young, pierced, bright purple hair, laptop covered in activist stickers. If Frank was the lumberjack, Chloe was the eco-punk fairy godmother. She took one look at Leo's blueprints, then at Frank, then at Leo. A slow grin spread across her face. So, we're building a squirrel city to stick it to your HOA president. That is an eloquent and accurate summary, Leo replied. I'm in, she said without hesitation. I'm thinking clover lawns for the residential areas, moss for the spa roof, cobblestone squirrel streets made from pebbles, and for the plaza, a recirculating fountain, calms the rodents, doubles as a bird bath. And just like that, the fellowship was born. Frank, the master builder, Chloe, the eco-punk landscaper, and Leo, the eccentric visionary with too much spite and too many almonds. Together, they weren't just building squirrel houses. They were building a republic. The dining table became their war room. Blueprints spread out, wood samples stacked, moss trays lined up like ammunition. Frank argued about load-bearing walls. Chloe sketched drainage systems to prevent squirrel flooding. Leo sat there like an eccentric billionaire funding a passion project, sipping coffee and occasionally adding things like, what if we build them a wellness spa with pine cone massages? And the wildest part? Frank and Chloe didn't laugh. They nodded. They sketched. They treated this with deadly seriousness, because that's the thing about true artists. They don't ask why. They ask, how much cedar do we need for the nut bank vault? In that moment, Leo realized something important. He wasn't just a guy with a petty grudge anymore. He was a founder, a revolutionary, a suburban George Washington about to declare independence from beige tyranny with Frank and Chloe as his cabinet. Nottingham was no longer just an idea. It was a mission. But revolutions aren't won with blueprints alone. You've got to build. And when the first hammer swung, Carol's blood pressure probably spiked into orbit.
Every good story has a turning point. That moment where the villain realizes the hero isn't just a minor nuisance, he's a full-on nightmare. For Carol, that moment came the third day of construction, when she finally decided to storm the battlefield herself. By now, Leo's backyard had transformed into something out of a surreal HGTV special titled Extreme Makeover Rodent Edition. Frank was up on a stepladder, hammer in hand, fitting shingles on the roof of the Nutty Acorn Tavern. Chloe was crouched low, carefully arranging pebbles into a perfect cobblestone path, her purple hair gleaming in the sun. And Leo? He was standing back, arms crossed, watching Nuttingham rise from the grass like a proud, petty god surveying his creation. Of course, Carol couldn't ignore it. She'd been watching through her kitchen window nonstop, binoculars in hand, like a Cold War spy. Every day, her patrols got more frequent. Every lap with her terrified poodle Fifi grew sharper, angrier. And finally, she snapped. The gate swung open with the ferocity of a courtroom entrance. There she was, Carol, pink polo practically vibrating with rage, visor slicing sunlight, clipboard clutched like Excalibur. She didn't just step into Leo's yard. She invaded. Ike froze mid-acorn nibble. Even the hammering stopped. "What is this?" she shrieked, her voice 2 octaves higher than usual. She gestured wildly at the emerging squirrel Utopia. "This is an unapproved structure. Several unapproved structures. I'm going to fine you into oblivion." Leo, calm as ever, didn't even flinch. He picked up a half-finished miniature lamppost and said cheerfully, "Good morning, Carol. Isn't it a beautiful day for creating art?" Carol nearly choked on her indignation. "Art? This is a slum, a rodent slum. You're in violation of—" But before she could finish, Frank spoke. And let me tell you, when Frank speaks, the world listens. From the top of the stepladder, beard flecked with sawdust, voice as deep as a canyon, he said, "Ma'am, I take offense to that. The craftsmanship on these dwellings is impeccable. We're using Brazilian walnut for the town hall trim. It's naturally weather resistant. Lovely contrast with the cedar siding." Carol blinked. She was not prepared for technical jargon. She tried again. This cantilevered balcony, this is unsafe." "Unsafe. That balcony has been reinforced to hold 3 full-grown squirrels in a moderate gale. I did the math." If looks could kill, Carol would have exploded into pink confetti. But before she could regroup, Chloe stood up, brushing dirt from her hands, and added sweetly, "And the landscaping is designed to be environmentally synergistic. Native mosses, minimal watering, excellent insulation. Honestly, this project could qualify as green certified." Now, Carol was outnumbered, 3 against 1. Her visor fogged with pure rage. She sputtered, "Bylaws, fines, property values." But the words sounded hollow, flimsy, drowned out by the sheer confidence of Frank's sawdust gravitas and Chloe's eco-science sass. Leo, of course, couldn't resist twisting the knife. "Carol," he said, voice dripping with mock concern, "are you anti-art?" That was it, the coup de grace. Her entire persona was built on being the guardian of order, the self-appointed protector of suburban beige culture. And here was Leo, painting her as an enemy of creativity, of beauty, of squirrel wellness spas. She didn't have a comeback. She just stood there, clipboard trembling, face redder than a stop sign. Finally, with one last sputter about property values, she spun on her heel and marched back to her house, poodle dragging behind her like a hostage in retreat. The battlefield was quiet again. Frank shook his head. Some people just don't appreciate craftsmanship. Chloe smirked. "She's threatened because we're building something beautiful." And Leo, of course, smiled, sipping his coffee like a man who just won round 1. Because in HOA wars, silence speaks volumes. And that silence, it was Carol's worst nightmare. She wasn't defeated, not yet,
But she was rattled, and a rattled HOA president is a dangerous thing. She was already plotting her next move, something bigger, something louder, something that would bring in the authorities. Because when clipboards fail, dictators do the unthinkable. They call in the government. And that's when this Squirrel City went from neighborhood feud to full-blown suburban legend.
When dictators feel their grip on power slipping, they always pull the same move. Call in the cavalry. In history, that usually meant armies. In the suburbs, it means city officials with clipboards, and if that fails, dialing 911 like it's a personal customer service line. And Carol? Oh, Carol wasn't about to lose her war against Nuttingham without summoning every authority within a 20-mile radius. It started small. The first to arrive was Gary, a weary city code enforcement officer whose energy levels hovered somewhere between stuck in traffic and waiting at the DMV. Carol met him at the curb, poodle in tow, pointing furiously at Leo's backyard like she was identifying a crime scene. Gary trudged over, clipboard in hand, the kind of man who looked like he had exactly 47 more payments on his boat before retirement. He stopped in front of Nuttingham and just stared. The town hall stood proudly, roof perfectly shingled. The Nutty Acorn Tavern gleamed, the fountain burbled gently in Acorn Plaza, and Ike, bless his fluffy little soul, scampered across the cobblestones like the mayor greeting constituents. "What am I looking at?" Gary asked flatly. "It's a Squirrel City. Lawn art. Fully compliant." Gary blinked, took a slow sip of air, and sighed. The kind of sigh that carries the weight of 25 years of dealing with suburban nonsense. "Are any of these structures permanently affixed to the ground with a concrete foundation?" "Nope," Leo said proudly. "Gravel pads for drainage." Gary made a note. "Any of these over 120 square feet? Biggest one's 4 square feet? Town hall?" Another note. Gary clicked his pen shut with the finality of a man who just decided not to care. "It's lawn art. Regulations don't cover it. Have a nice day." Carol's jaw hit the floor. But it's a nuisance. It's vermin housing. Arrest him." Gary trudged back to his sedan like a man walking away from a particularly boring episode of reality TV. No ticket, no fine, no demolition order. Just pure bureaucratic apathy. Round one to Leo. But Carol wasn't done. Oh no, if local code wouldn't save her, she was going bigger. 2 days later, a black and white cruiser rolled up. That's right, Carol called the cops. 2 officers stepped out. Officer Miller, the veteran, looked like he'd seen it all. Thick mustache, shoulders slumped under the weight of 1,000 noise complaints. His younger partner, Officer Sanchez, looked sharp, serious, still clinging to the faint hope that law enforcement could be glamorous. Carol rushed them like they were reinforcements at Waterloo. "Officers, thank goodness! He's built an entire city for rodents. It's illegal. It's a public nuisance. Arrest him." The officers exchanged a look. A perfect mix of, is this real life? And I should have taken a different shift. They followed Carol into the backyard, and then they saw it. Nuttingham in all its glory. Frank was tightening the last shingles on the library roof. Chloe was arranging moss around the wellness spa. The fountain trickled, the plaza gleamed, and Ike, on cue, puffed his chest out on the town hall balcony like a furry statesman. "What am I looking at?" Miller finally asked, his voice strained of all life. "Welcome to Nuttingham," Leo said proudly, sweeping his arm across the squirrel metropolis like a tour guide at Disney World. "That's the town hall. Tavern's over there, spa still under construction, but the squirrels are very excited." Carol nearly combusted. "He's mocking you! Mocking the law! Arrest him!" Sanchez turned slightly, shoulders shaking, fighting laughter. She raised her radio. We're on scene at the Maple Creek disturbance. It's... stand by. Yeah, dispatch, it's a tiny city for squirrels." "No, I'm not high." Meanwhile, Miller walked the perimeter with grim solemnity, inspecting every detail like a general reviewing his troops. He stopped at the gristmill that Frank had insisted on adding, poked the water wheel, and watched it spin. "Did you build this yourself?" "With help from professionals,"
Leo said, gesturing to Frank and Chloe. Miller nodded. Good work. He turned to Carol. Ma'am, I don't see any laws being broken here. Carol nearly fainted. But it's vermin. Miller shrugged. So's your neighbor's garbage can. You call the SWAT team for that? Game, set, match. As the officers left, Sanchez couldn't resist. She pulled out her phone and asked, Mind if I get a picture? My kids will lose their minds. Click. The first unofficial fan photo of Nuttingham. And Carol? She stood frozen on Leo's lawn, face twisted in impotent rage. She'd called in the government. The government laughed, and now Nuttingham wasn't just a backyard rebellion, it was a police-approved tourist attraction. And here's the thing about revolutions. They're contagious. Once the neighbors smelled freedom, Carol's empire of pink slips started to crumble.
Up until now, Nuttingham had been Leo's personal war. One man, one squirrel general, one dream of rodent utopia, standing against the clipboard tyranny of Carol. But revolutions don't stay private for long. They spread. And once the neighbors caught wind of what was going on, Carol's grip on Maple Creek Estates didn't just crack, it shattered. It started quietly. A nod at the mailbox. A whispered, "Hey, I heard about the squirrel thing, that's hilarious." Then a chuckle from David, the quiet accountant next door, who confessed that he and his wife had been secretly rooting for someone, anyone, to stand up to Carol. She'd fined them last Christmas for leaving their lights up 2 days too long. 2 days. Word spread fast. Nuttingham wasn't just a city anymore. It was a symbol, a declaration of independence from beige tyranny. Suddenly, Leo wasn't just the eccentric guy with the squirrel problem. He was the neighborhood's George Washington, leading the charge against Carol's monarchy of mediocrity. And it wasn't just gossip. People wanted in. They wanted to be part of the rebellion. Leo decided Nuttingham deserved more than secrecy. It deserved a grand unveiling. If Carol could host HOA meetings filled with rules and fines, he could throw a party filled with squirrels, lemonade, and community spirit. So he designed invitations. Not just any invitations. Oh no. Thick cardstock, flowing script, a regal sketch of General Eisenhower in full profile, looking every bit the 5-star rodent he was. The text read, "You are cordially invited to attend the official grand opening and ribbon-cutting ceremony of the Township of Nuttingham. Join us for light refreshments for humans, nuts for squirrels, and a celebration of art, community, and rebellion." And how did he deliver them? Genius. Each invitation was rolled into a tiny scroll, tied with rustic twine, and placed on neighbors' porches, alongside a pile of premium nuts. That way, the squirrels themselves became the mail carriers of revolution. The response was electric. The usually dead neighborhood text chain lit up like fireworks. Excited messages flew back and forth. Are you going? You bring in the kids? Finally, someone put Carol in her place. The buzz built. By the day of the unveiling, anticipation was through the roof. When the big moment came, Leo's backyard looked like a festival. Dozens of neighbors gathered, plastic cups of lemonade in hand, mingling, laughing, gawking at the tiny squirrel city like tourists in Rome. Kids lay on their stomachs, peering into windows, squealing as squirrels darted through cobblestone streets. Even grumpy Mr. Henderson from 3 doors down cracked a rare smile when he saw Ike proudly strut into the nut bank, carrying a walnut bigger than his head. And then came the kicker. A news van pulled up. That's right, Channel 8 had heard the story. The tale of a squirrel utopia built out of spite had gone viral on social media, thanks to David's teenage son posting his invitation on TikTok. By the time the reporter, Susan, showed up in her bright blue blazer, Leo's backyard wasn't just a party, it was a press event. Frank gave an impromptu interview explaining squirrel-scale load-bearing math like he was pitching Shark Tank. Chloe showed kids how the moss roof helped regulate squirrel spa temperatures. Neighbors clapped, laughed, and cheered. And Leo? He stood tall on his porch steps, glass of lemonade in hand, delivering a speech worthy of the history books. Nuttingham, he said, is more than tiny buildings. It's proof that no one, not even an HOA president with too much hairspray and a clipboard, can tell you what to do in your own backyard. This is about freedom, about community, about the fact that even the smallest voices, yes, even the squeakiest, deserve a beautiful place to live.
The crowd erupted in applause. Squirrels darted across rooftops like furry fireworks. And at that moment, Leo realized Nuttingham wasn't his anymore. It belonged to the neighborhood. Carol, of course, was watching. You could practically feel the fury seeping out of her beige walls. But what could she do? Her neighbors were united. Her clipboard had lost its power, and the more people cheered, the more she realized she was no longer feared. She was outnumbered. Nuttingham had sparked a movement. And Carol? She was about to make the fatal mistake every tyrant makes when their empire starts to crumble. Doubling down in public, because revolutions always need a meltdown moment. The point where the villain loses it so spectacularly, the whole world sees them for what they really are. And Carol's meltdown? Oh, it was legendary.
Every great rebellion has its defining scene, that one moment historians point to and say, that's when the tide turned. For Maple Creek Estates, that moment wasn't the building of Nuttingham, the cops shrugging it off, or even the news coverage. No, the true turning point was Carol's meltdown, a full-blown, unhinged, Olympic-level tantrum that would forever be remembered as the day the HOA lost its iron grip. It happened at the grand opening of Nuttingham, in front of neighbors, children, squirrels, and, crucially, a live local news camera. Channel 8's Susan had just finished interviewing Leo, who gave a rousing speech about freedom, almonds, and community spirit. The applause was still echoing when Carol made her entrance. And let me tell you, she didn't stroll in quietly. She stormed. Her visor was tilted, her pink polo soaked in sweat, and her clipboard, oh, that clipboard, was clutched in both hands like she was about to perform an exorcism. She marched through the crowd, knocking over a lemonade cup, practically dragging poor Fifi the poodle behind her. The chatter died instantly. All eyes turned. Carol had entered the chat. "This," she screeched, pointing dramatically at the Squirrel Tavern, "is an outrage." The crowd gasped, but not because of the words. No, it was the sheer volume. Carol had gone full banshee. Her voice cracked like a badly tuned kazoo, echoing off the beige houses around them. Even the squirrels froze mid-snack, tiny paws clutching nuts, as if bracing for impact. Leo, of course, stayed calm. Too calm. Smiling like a man watching exactly what he wanted unfold. "Carol," he said smoothly, "so glad you could make it. Care for a tour? The spa's running a special on pine cone massages." That was it. That was the match to the gasoline-soaked rage Carol had been bottling for weeks. She snapped. Clipboard raised, visor quivering, she launched into what can only be described as a Shakespearean monologue of suburban hysteria. "These are vermin hotels. You are destroying property values. The bylaws. Section 14, subarticle C." She rattled off numbers so fast she sounded like an auctioneer at a yard sale for broken dreams. But here's the kicker. The more she ranted, the more the crowd laughed. Quiet at first, snickers from the back, then louder, a full-on wave of giggles. Chloe even whispered, "She's quoting bylaws like she's reading scripture." Frank shook his head solemnly. "I've seen chainsaws less unhinged than this woman." And then came the viral moment. Carol, red-faced and sweating, pointed directly at Ike, who was perched proudly on the town hall balcony like a tiny fluffy mare addressing his people. "You!" she screamed. "You disgusting little rodent! You don't belong here! You're Before she could finish, Ike flicked his tail and, no joke, launched a peanut straight off the balcony. It arced gracefully through the air and bounced off Carol's visor with a satisfying plink. The crowd erupted. Cheers. Applause. Someone shouted, "Mayor Ike for HOA president." A kid yelled, "Squirrel 1, Carol 0." And Susan, bless her, kept the camera rolling. The footage hit the evening news that night. The headline? HOA president loses it over Squirrel City. By the next morning, the clip was all over TikTok, Twitter, and Facebook. Millions of views. Memes exploded. Carol photoshopped as Godzilla attacking Nuttingham. Ike, crowned with photoshopped laurels, captioned, "All hail the Nutmare." Even late-night hosts got in on it. One joked, "Some HOA presidents keep property values high. This one just went viral for yelling at squirrels."
Another cracked, that Squirrel City has more community spirit than most real towns. And here's the best part. The internet didn't just laugh. They chose sides. And spoiler alert, it wasn't Carol's. Hashtags trended. Hashtag Nuttingham strong. Hashtag I stand with Ike. Hashtag bye bye Carol. Carol had gone from suburban tyrant to international punchline overnight. Her neighbors? Oh, they loved it. Suddenly she wasn't feared anymore, she was pitied. People waved peanuts at her when she walked by. Teenagers blasted the video from Bluetooth speakers. One guy even stuck a fake eviction notice on her door that read, "Fined for disturbing the peace of Nuttingham." Leo didn't have to lift a finger. Carol had demolished her reputation in front of the world, live, on camera. And all it took was a squirrel with good aim. But if you think the story ends with Carol's meltdown, think again. Because Nuttingham wasn't just a rebellion, it was about to become something bigger. Something permanent. Something that made even the HOA back down.
Every rebellion has its endgame. The French had Bastille Day, America had the Declaration of Independence, and Maple Creek Estates, they had Nuttingham, the squirrel utopia that not only survived Carol's clipboard crusade, but rose above it, tails twitching in victory. After Carol's meltdown went viral, things shifted fast. She tried to rally. She sent out one of her infamous HOA newsletters, typed in all caps, warning about vermin-related health risks and nuisance infrastructure. She even threw in a clip art skull and crossbones for dramatic effect. But here's the thing. Nobody cared anymore. Once you've been turned into a meme, you don't get to write manifestos that people take seriously. Neighbors ignored the newsletter. Some even taped it to their fridges as comedy. The power Carol once wielded, her clipboard authority, her ability to shame and fine, was gone. You can't enforce conformity on a neighborhood that's united by laughter. The community had seen Nuttingham, cheered for Ike, and laughed at Carol's meltdown on loop. She wasn't the HOA president anymore. She was just the lady who got peanut bonked by a squirrel. Meanwhile, Nuttingham kept growing. Frank, fueled by spite and coffee, added a squirrel amphitheater. Chloe landscaped a squirrel park with tiny swings made from popsicle sticks. The kids in the neighborhood pitched in too, crafting signs like Acorn Street and Hazelnut Highway. What started as Leo's private act of defiance had become a community project, a living, breathing monument to petty creativity. And then came the ultimate twist, the HOA board itself. Carol had once ruled it with an iron visor, but now her fellow board members were spooked. They weren't just facing angry neighbors, they were facing national ridicule. Channel 8's coverage had been syndicated. Late-night shows mocked them. Even the mayor's office issued a tongue-in-cheek tweet, happy to report Nuttingham is fully compliant with city code. Long live Mayor Ike. At the next HOA meeting, things came to a head. Dozens of neighbors showed up, not to be scolded, but to revolt. They wore shirts with Ike's face on them. They waved tiny peanuts in the air like torches of rebellion. And when Carol tried to gabble the meeting to order, the crowd drowned her out with a chant, "Nuttingham! Nuttingham!" It was glorious. Democracy in its purest, most chaotic form. The board called for a vote, and in a landslide that made history, Carol was ousted as HOA president. Her replacement? David, the quiet accountant who'd once been fined for Christmas lights. His first act in office, an amendment to the bylaws officially protecting backyard creative expression, provided it does not endanger public safety. Translation: Nuttingham was legal, permanent, untouchable. Leo sat in the back, sipping a coffee, watching Carol's face collapse like a poorly baked souffle. She left the meeting in silence, visor drooping, clipboard tucked under her arm like a defeated general retreating from battle. No fanfare, no fight, just the end of an era. And so Nuttingham stood, not just as a backyard project, but as a monument, a victory for squirrels, a victory from neighbors, a victory for anyone who's ever been fined for a lawn being 0.5 inches too tall. By the next month, Nuttingham was a local landmark. Families visited on weekends. Kids played Squirrel Mare in the plaza. Susan from Channel 8 ran a follow-up segment titled From HOA Feud to Community Treasure. Even the City Tourism Board listed it on their website as a quirky attraction. As for Ike, he thrived.
He patrolled his city with the pride of a true statesman, tail flicking like a victory banner. In a way, I could become more than a squirrel. He was a symbol, a tiny, furry reminder that no clipboard, no bylaw, no HOA tyrant can stop people from enjoying a little joy, a little mischief, and the lot of nuts. As for Leo, he got what he wanted all along. Not just to feed his squirrel buddy, but to prove a point, that community spirit beats petty rules every time. He didn't just win against Carol, he inspired a neighborhood and maybe even the internet to embrace rebellion in the tiniest, most delightful ways. So yes, Nuttingham won, Carol lost, and somewhere in the annals of suburban history, a new legend was written. The tale of one man, one squirrel, and a city built not from bricks or mortar, but from almonds, defiance, and a refusal to bow to beige conformity. So next time you're fined by your HOA for a lawn gnome, a bird feeder, or some imaginary violation, remember Nuttingham, remember Ike, and remember the best revenge isn't anger, it's creativity so bold, so ridiculous, that it leaves the clipboard warriors sputtering in your dust. Oh, and hey, if you loved this saga of suburban rebellion, make sure to smash that like button, drop a comment with your wildest HOA story, and subscribe for more HOA Wars chaos. Because trust me, we're just getting started.